What am I saying again?
This is MPW.
MPW.
The podcast.
With your host,
Xylo Aria. Cool.
A podcast about music production
for the everyday musician,
where we learn from experienced studio engineers and each other.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the MPW Podcast. I'm your host, Xylo Aria, and today we are so lucky to be chatting to Dom Smart, also known as Neurodriver. So Dom does loads of different things, including sound design, editing, music production, sound engineering, mixing, programming, synth programming, and creating plugins. So just such a variety there, Dom.
Well, hello and thank you for having me on the show.
Yeah, very good to have you here. And we'll be talking about sound design and we'll get to that in a minute. But how's your day been over there, Dom? You're based in the UK?
Yeah, pretty busy at the moment. A lot of projects going on. Right now, I'm pretty consumed with the software development side of things. So last few years, I've been running a company called Devious Machines, and we're making plugins for music producers, sound designers, that kind of thing. So we're just putting the finishing touches on a new product we'll have out soon. So,
oh, that's exciting. Did you start that company?
Yes, with a friend of mine, Jim, who's another developer. We've been working hard at this over the last few years. Released, we're on our fourth product now.
Yeah, wow. So it just sounds like you do so many different things, which is great. And I'm sure, some lend themselves to others. But I'd be keen to know how you kind of got to where you are today. And I'm sure there were a lot of twists and turns into your journey to now programming. So, I'd love to hear a bit more about that.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I'm from a really musical family. My dad's an organist. My mum was a violin teacher. So I had the real privilege of a musical education from them. They got me cello lessons. I did a bit of musical theory. I think they were quite keen for me to take up the classical music thing. But, like many teenagers growing up in the 90s, I was just besotted with the explosion of interesting electronic dance music that was happening at the time. And just became fascinated with that side of things, really. And very much curious to find out about music technology, learn how all these really interesting new sounds were made. So buried myself in the world of computer music and synthesizers really as much as I could. Wound up going to university to do the Tom Meister degree at Surrey, which, funny enough, I saw you had Olga Fitzroy on the show a while ago because we were at uni there together.
I was just going to say, I was like, I wonder if you were there at the same time as
Yes,
Olga.
we were actually. We used to hang out. Great to see her doing so well. But went there and as part of that degree, they send you on a year in industry to do a placement. And I did mine at Electronic Arts, the games company. So after I'd finished my degree, I wound up working for them. So that was my inroad into doing the sound design side of things, really. But at the same time, I was always working on music, writing electronic music. After uni, set up a group with my friends called Far Too Loud, and we made a bunch of breakbeat music and ended up, having a lot of fun doing that. It was always sort of working parallel careers, really. I was doing half music, which I dipped in and out of as a profession, sometimes doing it full time, but then also doing the kind of sound design type game development work for quite a while as well, because I'm sure it comes up a lot. It's very difficult to make a full-time career out of being a music artist, even though it's great fun. And that's just been it, really. Working game development that taught me a bit about making software, hence ending up doing what I'm doing now, with also being a music artist and DJ alongside of that. And I guess I just didn't like to stick to doing one thing too much.
That's awesome. Yeah, no, love it. And you did mention it's hard to, make money from being an artist, but also it's really great that there are other avenues such as sound design, which you're still working with sound and stuff. So that's still really great. And was that something that you sort of fell into and it became a way to generate income, or was that something that you were specifically really interested in, or maybe that developed over time?
Maybe a bit of both, I suppose. The option to work at the games company was something that came up through the university's links with industry. And when that option came up, as a young third-year student, I thought, well, that sounds interesting. I'll go and speak to them and have a look at it, because I'd always been interested in the tech side of things anyway. And I think just being a bit of a geek, it sort of suited my particular aptitudes. So yeah, got into that. But I was completely new to the world of sound design at the time. I was more, until that point, interested in music technology. So it was quite a learning curve, learning about the because that side of sound design is very much kind of rooted in the film industry artistically. Although there's the whole kind of tech and software side of it as well. So it's an interesting sort of amalgamation of worlds.
Oh, fascinating. That's really interesting. And yeah, something you mentioned before we started the interview was sound design is such a broad topic and can mean so many different things. And I've definitely heard that from people, even with running MPW, people ask, how do I get better at sound design? And that's just such a broad question, I would say. So do you, by any chance, have a one-sentence definition for what sound design is?
Well, I thought long and hard about that question because it's actually it's a simple question with no easy answer, I think. Because, yeah, like you say, I mean, the term sound design means such different things to different people and depending on what industry you're in. I mean, I suppose broadly speaking, it's just, I would say, the creative process of crafting and manipulating audio. But that in itself can mean so much. I think the term was originally coined in connection with the film industry when it made the transition through being sound effects as being a thing that was recorded on set and, to go with to kind of create the sort of sounds you might experience in real life, into a more sort of creative role where the sound effects played a much more kind of emotional role in the experience you would have with the film. And it's turned into a real art form in itself, which is just as important to movies as the music these days, I would say. So I guess, the term was coined to describe that more creative role. But in the context of music, it means something very different as well. So, I hear a lot of people talk about sound design in the context of electronic music producers who are actually putting a lot of effort into making their own sounds, making sounds in the music which no one's ever heard before. So I suppose the process is analogous but not the same because whilst there's a big overlap in skills, they mean slightly different things. And I doubt, I doubt that people who do sound design for the world of music would necessarily be able to jump straight into sort of doing the sound design for a film or a game, for example, because they're such different skill sets.
Different skill sets. Yeah, cool. Well, you've, I guess, covered a few different areas that sound design might be used in, which is great. And it's interesting to talk about other areas where this comes into play. Like, I think, I'm not sure if you mentioned gaming yet, but anything outside of those big areas?
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, software, I suppose, user interfaces, websites, cars. I think probably everybody of my generation has that Windows startup sound that was designed by Brian Eno kind of etched into their memory, from Windows 95. Even, in the world of radio, TV, drama, theatre, there are sound designers of a different type working in those fields.
That's so interesting. I never thought of most of those things. Fascinating. And you said cars. Is that the sort of sound design for electric cars or?
Even petrol engine cars now, a lot of them have fake engine sound that comes through the speakers to make them more exciting. And then there's the sound of the user interfaces and so on. Not to mention all the branding, the advertising and so on. These are I mean, the sound plays such an important part to the to how a brand is experienced by people. That a lot of effort and thought goes into that.
Yeah. Oh, fascinating. So interesting. So when you are designing a sound, let's say for something in film, and I know that's probably really, really broad, where do you start? Is there some sort of like blank canvas that you start with, or is it different every time?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the first part of designing a sound effect for something will be understanding what it actually is, what's making the sound, where it fits in the context of a scene. Perhaps what kind of personality or emotion that sound's going to convey. I mean, my experience, I have no experience in the world of films, but in games it's very similar. And we're always watching films for inspiration, taking a great deal of technique from that world. And I mean, I would say, it does really depend on what it is. If it's a central character or central element to a scene, it's going to be something really important. So, yeah, I might spend some time understanding what it is, think about what kind of elements I want to use, how it's going to make people feel. It's a bit like if you're, say, selecting a drum sound to put in a mix. Are you going to pick a big thundering kick drum if you want people to feel excited, or is it going to be something more, softer and laid back? And I mean, something you see in a film sound a lot, or one of the techniques that gets used fairly often, so much it's almost a cliche actually, is the mixing of either human or animal sounds into things that are completely mechanical. For example, say a fireball appears on screen. One of the really common things that you'll hear in those are like a lion roar or some like fierce animal sound mixed into the sound of the flame. So suddenly it has a personality and it's got some organic element to it.
Wow, I can almost like see it in my mind's eye, like a fireball with a roar, and it just sounds so natural. So when you say emotion, would you say that certain types of sound lend themselves to a more sad scene and like happy or anger or something like that?
I mean, I suppose, yes, the way the sound is presented can have a big impact on how you perceive a certain scene. Like something you'll often see where you have an emotional scene, or the sounds become very close, very, very intimate. And sometimes part of it's in the mixing, but part of it's in the kind of sounds that are chosen. Like you'll get, like, for example, a lot of emphasis on the Foley, the sound of the clothes, or the sound that people's bodies make as they're moving and stuff. And that can kind of bring the listener in really close to the scene. Whereas, anger, well, an example like the lion roar I just mentioned, that can be something ferocious that could be added to something inanimate to give that sound a whole different personality. So, there's really just such a broad spectrum once you begin to unpack it of things that sound effects can do, which and the wonderful thing about it, like in a similar way to music, is it functions on a very subconscious level. So people aren't necessarily aware of this stuff when they're watching a movie or playing a game, but it's there, and it's something just giving an extra layer of depth to what you're perceiving. And once you start to kind of listen to this stuff critically and analysing it, you'll start hearing these little animal sounds and other human elements everywhere.
Yeah.
One real treat I had a few years ago was I was working on a Star Wars game for Disney, and I got delivered some of the original sound effects tracks from Ben Burtt from the original Star Wars series, which in the sound design world are legendary. So I probably just spent a good hour in my studio listening to R2-D2's bleeps and whistles in isolation, which is really fascinating because, I mean, you listen to it in the film and you'd think it sounds synthetic, but listening to that track under a microscope, it's full of little human sounds, whistles, all sorts of things that are just mixed in with the sounds of a synthesizer and blended together in this really interesting way.
Wow, that's so interesting. Like even you just sort of mentioning those few things of like clothes rustling and stuff, like it's something that I've never even thought of. So yeah, it's fascinating to think about it in that detail, and I feel like I might change the way I watch film now just to kind of listen out for those things. So really, really cool to hear that background. And when you are designing these sounds, do you more often use samples or would you more often record? Do you have a process?
I would say both, equally important. Quite often, working on commercial jobs, time is always a pressure. So there just simply won't be the opportunity to create everything from scratch, much as we'd all like to. So, I think it would depend on the actual element that was being designed. If it's a central element to the film or to the game or what have you, one might spend some time recording some really unique sounds, really getting all the elements that are going to go into making that something special and unique. If it's a door slamming in the background, it's a transient event and probably not so important, then it's fine to use a sample. And I think something I would say for anybody interested in perhaps getting into doing sound design is one of the best things you can have, other than kind of developing the skill set for yourself, is a large library of samples that you can search quickly. Every sound designer has to have a big database at their fingertips because, that time you just need a a footstep or a door slam or the sound of a window closing or something, you're not going to have time to go out and record every single element. So yes, samples, absolutely.
Is there somewhere you'd recommend to source these?
I know Boom Sound Effects do loads of really good libraries. There's a site called Sound Dogs on the net where you can just search if you want a particular sound effect. You can tap in what you want into there and just download individual sounds. Sound ideas libraries are a staple in that world, and there's plenty out there.
Right, and yeah, so you mentioned about mixing during the sound design process, and how does that usually work, or how would you go about that? I would have thought that with sound design, you might have like a single sound coming out or something like that. So maybe it's not as important with the mix, but what are your thoughts on that?
I would say that mixing is just as important as any music mix, and can often be more complicated actually, because with a lot of music, you have a fairly well-defined set of instruments, whereas in a sound effects film or game mix, you can have any number of things going on at once. And in the film world, it's common to have somebody whose job is dedicated to mixing the whole sound team. So yeah, it's definitely something that needs to be thought about. Games throw up their own set of challenges, because whereas in a film, it's pretty deterministic which sounds are happening at once because it's set to a picture and the action's the same. In a game, it can very often be different every time. So in that world, one gets into the area of dynamic mixing, which is setting up rules. And much as you might do something like in a mix where you sidechain a bus from a kick drum to punch a hole in the mix for that sound, you would do the same thing with sound effects too.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I didn't really think about that in a game. You could have all the sound effects sort of at once, depending on what's happening in the game. So something to think about. That would make it quite challenging, I would have thought. So are there any techniques or resources that you'd recommend to improve your sound design skills?
Yes, absolutely. And I think just with music mixing, probably the primary skill is learning to listen critically, listening to how other people do the soundtracks to films, adverts, listening for the emotion in sound, how different things are put together, what gives sounds their character, what makes a good or bad mix. Yeah, and then I would say recording is a really important area. So location, studio recording, Foley, which is, that's when you act out sort of movements in the studio to, recreate the sound of people moving around, footsteps, that kind of thing. And to a lesser extent, I suppose, for the sound effects world, synthesizer programming and effects processing, that kind of thing, always plays a role.
Right. Okay. And did you study all that in your degree, or was it mostly learnt on the job?
Completely learnt on the job. What I should say as well, there are some really good blogs out there. A couple of them I read sometimes, designingsound.org and soundeffect.com. And there are lots of interviews, articles on there to do with the sound of various games, films, TV shows, all sorts. So that's a really, really interesting resource for people who want to find out more about that.
All right. And are there any particular plugins that you really love or you use really often in what you do?
Plugins, I think just having a good bread and butter set of sound engineering tools is really useful. I like the Waves plugins, but I mean, actually most DAWs come with a decent set already. A few good quality reverbs, really handy. I love the Valhalla plugins for that. They're great. For music stuff as well, they're just fantastic. Not too expensive either. Because I'm a massive geek, I love Reactor. I mean, that's a whole world that you can choose to get into or not, but I found that really useful in the past, because if you don't have a particular effect or a combination of effects, you can make it. And for some video games I've worked on, particularly ones that hinge more around synthetic effects or sort of sci-fi creatures and so on, I've created a whole character by developing a Reactor instrument to process certain sounds, like take vocal sounds or animal elements and stretch them through some unique process I've made. So that's really good. But I mean, that's not something I would say you have to get into. It's a whole rabbit hole on its own. So
Right. Okay. Yeah. I don't know anything about Reactor actually. So, yeah, interesting that you managed to create whole characters out of that. So, really cool. So, if someone were to get into sound design or want to have a career in that industry, is there any advice that you have on where they should start?
Yes, I think, first of all, perhaps identifying the primary industry of interest, because as we talked about earlier, sound design for music technology is markedly different from doing sound design for, say, films, television, video games. Video games has its own set knowledge as well. So I think, not necessarily, you don't have to kind of pigeonhole yourself to one thing, but probably deciding on exactly which area is most of interest is a good place to start. And I think just learning about the art form, I mentioned those blogs earlier on, reading as much around the subject as possible, interviews with prominent sound designers, going back to the films or whatever they've talked about and listening to them critically, really starting to practice what I call active listening, which is, when you're sat watching a film, normally you take in the sound subconsciously because you're concentrating on the action, but really remembering to instead kind of separate yourself from what's going on visually and hone in on the soundtrack, really sort of think analytically about what's going on. A bit like when you get into music production, you start to hear the sounds in the records differently rather than just kind of absorbing the audio. You'll start to think about how these things are made, how they're put together, how they've been mixed. So these are all really, really good skills one can develop as a person starting out in sound design. What else? Qualifications can help. Definitely, there are lots of degree level courses around the country in both sound for films, television, and for video games. So they can be a really useful way of getting background knowledge, getting a first up on the ladder. But and the great thing now is though there's just so much information out there on the internet as well. So not doing a course shouldn't be a barrier to learning about these things.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Well, thanks so much for that insight, Dom. We have a couple of questions from our audience, and one is actually kind of an extension of what you just said, but from Carmel Komisky. So Carmel asked, what is the best mic for field recording?
So probably the most useful microphone you can have if you're going to do recording on the move is a good shotgun mic. So shotgun mics, really directional, so they zoom right in on what you point them at and aim to reject as much of the surrounding ambient sound and reflections as possible. So, that's really good if you're recording in a difficult environment or on the move. And the other thing which you'll always see people use when recording outdoors is a blimp, which are the large sort of lozenge-shaped containers that go around microphones. And the aim of that is just to reduce as much of the noise you get from the wind and movement as possible. So you end up with clean recordings and not recordings that are ruined by rumbling. And if you're recording in a windy environment, you could also get what they call a dead cat, the fluffy coating that goes around the outside of the blimp, which keeps as much of the wind off as possible. Although they're not made of real cats, just thought I'd say. If you're doing ambient recording, it's also good to have a nice pair of Omni mics. The DPA make really good lavalier mics, which are the type you often see them clipped to people's ties when they're doing interviews on TV. But those are actually really good for mobile ambient recording as well. Like Omni mics are much better at rejecting wind noise. They're a lot less coloured than the directional mics like shotguns. And being omnidirectional, they just pick up everything that's going on around you.
Cool. No, that's good. And Sam Warren, who you do know, asked, what are the materials that you design sound from? So she was saying, do you ever start with sort of noise as a starting point?
It depends on the sound, I suppose. In the world of sound effects, actually, I would tend to not use synthetic sources so much, and would tend to maybe pull something from the library or record something. It's really interesting going back to I mentioned earlier on the sound of Star Wars. It's really interesting how few of the sounds are synthetic, and you read the interviews with Ben Burton, he talks a lot about how, the sounds he's designed were tied back to the real world. Well, I wouldn't say there's necessarily a formula for it. It's more about just finding that noise that has got the right character or some element of something you like, I think.
Cool. Awesome. Well, thanks so much for being here with us today, Dom. It's been fascinating for me. So many things that I didn't really consider at all when we talk about sound design. So it's been interesting for me, and I'm sure for our audience as well.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on the show.
Yeah, it's been great. So it's like almost 10 p.m. for you. Is there anything else that you're working on tonight or no?
Not this evening, no. Sleep, I think.
Yeah. Good plan. I need to actually fix my sleeping pattern. So that sounds like a good idea. All right, cool. Thanks so much, Dom. Have a great evening.
Thank you. It was great talking to you.
We'll chat soon.